This is Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. Every organisation is driven by data, but how can you turn it into powerful storytelling? By asking the right questions, discovering the insights, and building your data story. This is the podcast that talks to leaders and thinkers around the world about how they use data smarter, so you can too. Welcome to Data Malarkey.
Hello and welcome. I'm your host, Sam Knowles. And joining us today is Mark Evans, one of the most successful marketers of his generation. He worked for 10 years at Mars, rising to be brand director of Petcare Europe, before spells as CEO of 118 Media UK and head of customer management, retail banking and wealth management for HSBC in the UK. In 2012, Mark joined leading UK insurance business Direct Line Group, where, in different roles over more than a decade, he helped to transform the business and the fortunes of its brands. Perhaps most notably, and in the teeth of stiff competition from price comparison websites, he relaunched and re-energized the company's flagship Direct Line brand. In that time, as well as championing the role of data and analytics in the company's decision-making, he even persuaded Harvey Keitel to come out of retirement, reprise his role as Winston Wolf from Pulp Fiction, and in the process drive the brand to new heights. When Mark left Direct Line at the end of 2022, he was Managing Director, Marketing and Digital, and a member of the company's Executive Committee. In 23, Mark's gone plural and is now a non-executive director, coach, speaker, and podcaster. Indeed, he's the regular co-host of the Places We'll Go marketing show, rapidly approaching, I'm amazed and impressed to say, Mark, its 300th episode. Guests have included many of the great names of modern marketing, from Unilever's Paul Polman to Professor Philip Kotter, from Mark Ritson to Byron Sharp. Though for those of you who know these academic luminaries of marketing, you won't be surprised that Mark and Byron did not appear on the same episode of Mark's podcast. Now, Mark, you're a much more accomplished and seasoned podcaster than me, and it's a pleasure and an honour to have you join us here today. Welcome to the Data Malarkey podcast.
Fantastic to be with you today, Sam. One tiny point of correction. We will get to 300, but currently we're on 123 episodes, Richie and I, with the Place We'll Go marketing show. But yeah, love doing that. I love doing podcasts. It's a chance to reflect and maybe pass on some things that help others. So great to be with you.
Very good. Now, Mark, before we get kind of down and dirty with data, and this isn't going to be a statistics class or anything like that, but I do want to talk about data and the role it's played in your career, in your day-to-day work. But before we do, can I ask you a question that doesn't necessarily ask you about your work? Can you tell me, Mark, how do you spend your time?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because I can answer it through a few lenses. From a work point of view, it's at the early stages of a portfolio career, so it's very mixed and varied and embryonic and exploratory, but broadly working in a few non-exec roles that I've already carried forward into this chapter, building a coaching practice and then working on a consultancy basis, and lots in between. So it's very varied, very mixed, very free and very liberating. I'd recommend it, although perhaps ask me in a year if it's still all that. Outside of that, I've been married for 25 years. Is that right? Sorry, 23? Gosh, terrible. 23 years to Lorna, who was one of the first people I met at university. We're in halls of residence together. We've got kids, George 17, Harriet 20. Harriet's flown the nest. So we've got a bit of time back. We like walks, we like films. I like to do a lot of exercise, so I'm Peloton, run, walk. Sadly, our beloved Bella, boxer dog, passed away not so long ago, so that's a little bit of a gap. But I mean, I feel like I have a very fortunate and privileged life. You know, there's no massive health issues going on. Getting a little bit older at the edges, but I just try and live life to the max. Always have, really.
Very good. Now, let's think about data a little bit. I imagine this may have changed in moving to go plural, but can you tell me kind of what role data plays and how important you believe data to be in your current role and maybe perhaps in your previous roles at Direct Line Group?
Yeah, I'm not a typical marketer in that I was destined to work in banking as a graduate. I did an economics degree and a master's in corporate strategy, and had a graduate job lined up in investment banking, corporate finance, Hill Samuel Bank, which was a subsidiary of TSB. And I was very happy with that destiny. I deferred that for a year to do a sports sabbatical post in the Students' Union at Nottingham University. And during that year, there was Lloyds and TSB came together, and my graduate job disappeared in a puff of smoke, which I have to say was a bit of a kick in the ghoulies at the time. But it saved me probably from a relatively average, possibly even worse than that, career in finance, because I've come to discover that marketing was probably a better fit. But having said all of that, I am a commercial guy, a commercial marketer, very data-driven, very analytical. And so I wouldn't describe myself really as at all creative, but I think I can create a context for creativity to happen in the team and through an agency networks and so on. So I suppose I've always been a bit more left brain, if that cliche holds. Very data-driven in everything I do. And of course, in Mars, marketing was a strategic leadership function. It wasn't anywhere near a colouring in function as sometimes marketing is described. So you had to be very commercially literate, not least marketers own the P&L. And then, of course, into Direct Line, I mean, it's the epitome of a data-driven organisation because the fundamental business model is about pricing for risk. So it's a very risk-focused, data-focused organisation. So it's sort of pretty intrinsic. And in the last couple of years, data-driven fluency, data-driven literacy has become a terminology. But I think for many, it's always been there, because otherwise, what does marketing default to? Now, I say all of that and data critical for impact and credibility. We might talk about it a bit, but that you mentioned, the launch into Harvey Keitel as Winston Wolf was much more of an instinctive decision, then backfilled with data and proven to be a bloody good decision. So I'm not saying it's only about data, but I think without that underpinning, you can really risk being perceived as being a bit lightweight, much more easily marginalized, less influential. You know, there's reputational risk from being data light. So it's just to be so intrinsic to everything I do, and I carry that forward into what I'm doing now. You know, when I'm helping others, I'm trying to be as data driven as possible, because why wouldn't you?
And what sort of data? I mean, I'm sure you kind of welcome all sorts of data, but what sort of data has been the heartbeat of your career, looking to validate and measure and test and learn as you, in the different roles you've had?
Yeah, it's true that it's permeated all the way through with some consistent points of sources of data, if you like. I mean, if I could probably bucket it up into three areas. The effectiveness of marketing as a thing is clearly the lifeblood. So really, what are the acquisition economics across both direct and platforms and aggregators? How are the numbers moving versus target to deliver on the results? And, ultimately, I've been responsible for aspects of e-commerce and the funnel means you have to be on your acquisition numbers. There's sort of no hiding place from that. So, and then of course, trying to be more sophisticated through time at Direct Line, we moved towards, incorporating LTVs into all our modeling. We were very heavy on econometrics and geo-testing and experimentation with the stand-up of Agile, which maybe we'll come on to. It's all data-driven experimentation. So, but the fundamentals of acquisition economics and marketing effectiveness has been a constant theme throughout. At different times and through my time at Direct Line, the whole customer experience regime, driving towards our NPS goals and satisfying customers, I mean, that also is probably less complex data, but that is all about creating a data infrastructure with the right cascade. So we might have some top-of-house NPS objectives that flow all the way down to every single colleague on the front line has a daily NPS score. So that's less about, as I said, complexity, but there's a wealth of data around that customer experience environment. And perhaps the third one really is around people data. So, attrition, cultural metrics, employee satisfaction, how things are trending there. So it's if you like, that it's kind of the market and your brand, customer experience, people experience. It pervades across all, but each have different flavors and dynamics. But in some levels, equally important because that's how the system succeeds.
I'm so impressed. I think I've heard you talk about this before, both the writing and on conference stages. But I'm so impressed to hear that every one of your team had a daily Net Promoter Score that they were looking to at least sustain or increase over the course of the day.
Well, yeah, I mean, it was one of the most impressive. It's called My Customer. We had My Customer 1.0, My Customer 2.0. It's a platform-based solution, but ultimately, we went very heavy on getting that feedback loop as near real time as possible, so that our staff knew how they were showing up. And what underlay this was perhaps one unifying metric which really carried the day, which was that some very clever people did some foraging around and deduced that there was a linear relationship between NPS and retention, which is sort of a no-brainer. People have good experiences, they like to stay longer. Now, from a 0 to a 10 NPS, now you never aspire to a 0, but anyway, it happens. From a 0 to a 10 NPS, there was a 35% retention delta, both across sales and service and claims for Churchill and Direct Line. Now, this was a miraculous discovery because we would sweat over 0.1 or 0.2% retention variability because it's so intrinsic and critical to the insurance business model. 35% debt, that's incredible. So this got everybody paying attention. I remember I was on my feet in front of investors and on an investor day showing this very chart. I think, wow, I mean, we just had no idea how critical customer experience was. And then they could understand that our customer orientation was a competitive advantage. So that then flowed through, why would we measure NPS on an individual basis on daily? Well, here you go, there's the evidence for it. But perhaps the bigger lesson is that the power of a unifying, simplifying metric that everybody can get behind. And in this case, everybody understood every interaction they had drove top and bottom line in a quantified way. That was really, really powerful. And so I'm now working with a couple of other organizations around how do you create a customer experience infrastructure. And there's lots of bottom-up experimentation, test and learn, prove, and so on. But I always hanker for that unifying metric that galvanizes everybody towards the common cause. Sometimes it's harder to find. Maybe Direct Line, we got a little bit lucky with this, link to NPS and retention. But it's always there somewhere, and just got to be curious enough to find it, and then that becomes the lightning rod for everything.
It sounds like in the journey. I know you were at Direct Line for more than 10 years, and that there were huge advances in both data management, in platforms, in the cloud. All sorts of things happened while you were there. I'm interested to know what challenges you face now and then in making sure that data was useful and usable to you. Be it clean or intact or whatever. But I mean, it sounds as though you were building a lot rather than inheriting a lot. You were building a lot there. That presumably helped. But what challenges did you face in making sure that data was useful and usable?
It's a great question because, like many legacy scale businesses, Direct Line had significant data challenges across platforms and data warehouses and so on. So personally, I didn't have to worry about the rawness of data because we had an analytics team. So everything that was sort of readily available could be nicely packaged up and good management information for decision making. But more broadly, the huge data challenges in terms of we had the best first party data in the industry, scale and longitudinally. But of course, it sits in different data silos, and really making the most of that first-party data through into CRM and personalization. I think, even despite my best efforts, we're really only just getting started at the point I exited. And so that was a specific reason that when we created our agile transformation, which myself and the Exco led in 2019, we created a data tribe, a data chapter, if you like, which was there specifically to drive forward to make our data more accessible and usable at an enterprise level. A bit like Google say, make all the world's data accessible and usable, or whatever the lingo is. And we had that mission internally. And that was tough because, there's lots of embedded processes, infrastructure, technology. And so at a macro level, I just think there was so much more to come. And it's that classic in insurance anyway, that all the greenfield operators have lots of flexibility and fluidity around data, but they just don't have so much of it. And then at the other end of the spectrum, the legacy players have got so much data that they literally don't know what to do with it, or can't do what they want to do, what to do with it. So that was the bigger macro challenge in terms of usefulness. And so more to come from Direct Line and insurance more generally, but how to unlock the potential of the inherent data that they hold.
And it must have been such a fascinating period, given that you're fighting against the price comparison websites, the aggregators, and that for your flagship brand, as I understand it, that's never been part of that. That you're always sitting separate from that. Here are these heavily invested, rapidly growing, data-first, digital native businesses, and yet you were able to use your data smarts. I mean, I'm particularly interested. Maybe you can tell us a bit more about this agile transformation. What that meant. Your data tribe sounds like a fantastic group of a group or a mentality. But maybe a little bit more about that battle with these digital first price comparison guys and how you managed to, because you outflanked them, right?
Well, I think it was a very elegant and, again, very simple portfolio strategy that we had. So we had a number of brands, both partners and own brands, including Churchill and Direct Line, of course, and Privilege. It was quite simple. Direct Line was the direct brand, and everything else played on comparison websites. And in so doing, we had the best of both worlds, could have our cake and eat it. Churchill was a very powerful price comparison website brand because the strength of the brand meant that it converted slightly further down the shopping trolley, if you like, down the queue, which is good because to be very top is the lowest margin, highest fraud, and potentially the worst risks. So that worked very well in the price comparison website context. And so it's a very interesting case study that people talk about the balance between performance and brand. 100% Churchill advertising was brand advertising. And this was the extreme case in point of the long and the short of it. For Direct Line, though, it's there's obviously some things I can't say, but what I can say is we had some golden economics, which was that for basically the same cost as the commission for price comparison websites, through having a strong brand where people would come direct, we had customers that were slightly better risks, slightly lower fraud, stayed slightly longer, upsell, cross-sell a bit more, ... We actually had a significantly higher lifetime value, LTV, at the same cost of acquisition. And of course, that then fueled the maintenance of the power of the brand itself. And we observed one by one others having to unwind that. And of course, as soon as you unwind the strength of the brand, you get into a bit of a vicious circle. So we maintained some golden economics in a virtuous circle throughout the whole period of time I was there. And there's a lovely arc to the story, which was it was the first direct brand 30 odd years ago, and the last direct brand when Aviva took the opportunity to go onto price comparison websites. But philosophically, we didn't say that to ourselves. We said we are not last brand standing, but first brand standing. As in, there's a whole nother chapter to come in insurance, which is about cross-sell, diversification, meeting more holistic life needs, etc. And so being a direct brand, we thought was a competitive advantage in that context. So I loved all the brands I worked on, but Direct Line has been a fascinating beast, not least for the fact that it has this beautiful arc over time.
Brilliant. Very good. Let's shift gear a bit and maybe focus on insight a bit. I mean, I know there are lots of definitions. For me, I like to think of it as being this profound and useful understanding. Profound because it allows us to answer the question, kind of, so what do these data mean? And useful because it allows us to go on and say and address the question, now what shall we do as the result? And you've talked about that eloquently already. Thinking about the way you have worked with data, the way you work with data now, what's your approach for extracting genuine insight from the data that you and your team work with?
We might dip into agile here. So I think the thing with data is that you can over-proliferate, and it's got to be about the so what. and it's got to be about proving and disproving hypotheses. Takes me all the way back to biology and chemistry A level. When you experimented, it was against a specific hypothesis. If you didn't have a hypothesis, it didn't get started. And that obviously then drives actionable recommendations against a desired outcome and ambition. I don't know other way to say it other than hypothesis-based. Of course, if we bring that to an agile context, and maybe this is where I can say a little bit more about that, we had an agile digital team since about 2013-14, founded by Ash Roots, great guy. Shout out to him. And then that was sort of established as a walled garden, reintegrated into the business. And then probably by that stage, we had about 15 agile teams, primarily dealing with digital channels, digital e-commerce. So we took the fairly big and brave decision in mid-2019, and obviously not knowing that the pandemic was around the corner, to go enterprise-wide agile. So we drank the Kool-Aid, we read the Agile Manifesto, we visited lots of people, we studied Spotify, we engaged McKinsey, and we did the Agile Playbook, which meant that save for finance, HR and risk and legal, who would more flow to work into these cross-functional squads that I'll describe, everything else became cross-functional, independent, autonomous, empowered teams who were given the missions, and then it was up to them how they went about it and how they procured and used the data that they wanted. And so marketing as an entity ceased. This was a marketing floor with a marketing team where marketers cohabit into purely cross-functional teams. There's still some things held centrally, of course, but the vast majority into cross-functional teams. Of course, when we went virtual, that even more so. So there's a thing about identity in an agile world, of course. But the lifeblood of those squads was to have a backlog, which was basically akin to a test regime where they're constantly testing and learning over a 2-week cycle, the normal sprint stuff, to drive towards their ambition. And so I think it's just that mindset of experimentation, test and learn and improvement. And actually, I would say probably maybe the closing point on Agile is that a lot of people talk about the nuts and bolts, the backlogs, the stand-ups, the sprint cycles, the retros, the quarterly business reviews, the OKRs, objectives, key results. But actually, I think across all of that, it is much more about mindsets than it is about methodology. Methodology is a bit of a distraction when you getting acclimatized, but mindsets is a bit like Drucker says, strategy, culture trumps strategy, eat strategy for breakfast. It's very much like that, I think, for Agile. And so that mindset really pervades all, and that mindset has to be one of experimentation and testing.
But you paint a picture of kind of paradoxically from the outside, what one might think the different functions within an insurance business not remotely would be mundane, but would be kind of bookish and serious. It sounds like an incredibly dynamic and fun place to work, and not in a kind of frivolous way, but I mean genuinely a challenging and different way to work that can accommodate many different types of people.
Yeah, and the beauty is that every single one of those squads is crafted for the specific intent, and so it's there's no vanilla wash here. It's very tailored, and it means that there's a place for everybody in that. Now, I would say it's not necessarily for everybody, because people who prefer traditional ways of working and like sitting next to Ben and Jemima. But of course, nobody's sitting next to anybody really these days. So that kind of went out the window. But I think it was, it's not easy. It takes a period of time, not least virtually. But I do think there's something in that in terms of pace and focus. And actually, just if I do flag one methodology point, the quarterly business review, which drives the objectives and key results, was in and of itself a brilliant thing, because it meant everybody had total visibility, not least ExCo, of what was going on, as opposed to all the pet projects, overlaps, duplications. So when it came to substantial resource reallocation, and I've seen from Direct Line's results just yesterday, they've really skewed resource towards motor, where they've got the biggest challenges. Those sort of conversations are not political, they're not contentious. It's much more visible and speedy to make big resource allocation decisions, because that particular methodology means everybody knows what's going on, what's the work that needs to be done. So I was a big fan of the quarterly business review, as opposed to things being set notionally at the outset of a year and then drifting, and who shouts loudest and all that.
Very good, very impressive. Now, I was touching on, and I know that you've talked about this in the historically, and I know it's a passion area for you. I'm interested in neurodiverse workforces, and I know that that's something that you champion. Could you talk to us a little bit about that, and maybe data in the context of championing neurodiverse workforces?
Yeah, my belief is that the role of the marketer, and I suppose any marketing leader, and I suppose any leader, is to create whole brain teams. Particularly in marketing, it obviously is a discipline. It spans from extreme left brain, all the marketing effectiveness and econometrics, all the way through to extreme right brain, whether that's insourced or not, in terms of the creative output and content. And there's this mythical unicorn, which is that person that can do the full spectrum from left brain to right brain. Now, maybe some can, but in the main, people have an epicenter, a point of focus. And so the challenge is to create whole brain teams. And this, for me, is the very essence of diversity. It is diversity of thought. Now, of course, I'm the first to say that diversity has a huge social justice and inclusion aspect. I chaired the DEI committee at Direct Line. But I think the bit that gets forgotten is the ... and the implicit benefit is diversity of thought. Now, if you hold that, then of course neurodiversity is talking to the fact that people's brains are wired fundamentally differently, and that potentially more than any previous life experience or orientation on any paradigm is more valuable because it's wired into people's brains. The diversity of thought comes at source in the chemistry and function and structures of an individual's brain. And so my journey started, my daughter was 8 years old, so 12 years ago, diagnosed with dyslexia, and just with everything in my life, just got really curious. In the end, started campaigning both internally and externally, helped set up with Lou Calvert, the Direct Line, the neurodiversity strand within the DEI agenda. And I just came to realize that this was the missing trick. It's the silent and invisible aspects of diversity that are typically underrepresented. And one aspect of that, of course, is brilliance of some individuals, many individuals with neurodiversity, as relates to data. And so actually we worked with a company called Auticon, who you could argue weren't the most inclusive of organizations in that they only help to recruit and place people with autism. You could forgive them for that, I guess. But that was a fascinating experience because they didn't use any interviews or CVs. It was skills testing, task matching to capability. And I remember one specific instance where there was a very, very, very technical piece of analytics required in one team that had over 100 years of experience, and they really hadn't made the breakthrough. And so we approached Auticon, and they placed somebody who turned out to be brilliant, who fixed the problems with a cherry on top of the icing, on top of the cake, in record time. And it was a very different work context in terms of the way they were working together. But that individual was amazing in terms of unlocking a really big problem for us. And so I just think there's sort of that. And then I overlay that, for example, take autism. I think there's only 8% employment, and generally neurodiversity over-indexes with people being homeless, in prison, mental health issues, as well as unemployment. And so for me, this is, if what gets my goat is people don't get a chance to fulfill their potential, then this is a really big one, because there's companies who've got some really knotty problems, not least data problems, and there's some data geniuses out there, and somehow the market doesn't match up very well, and there isn't an established platform for this. So it's something that I'll continue to to push as an agenda, because it's a tragedy that this happens.
Terrific. No, that's true. That's true. I mean, it's a terrific issue, but that example is a fantastic one. Thinking about effective communication and blending, I'm not necessarily looking for a unicorn answer here in your words, but what do you think is the best way to bring narrative and numbers together? If you're making a case to the executive committee, if you're talking to investors, what do you think is the best way of making stories and statistics stick together?
Well, I guess it would be, this is the marketer in me saying it depends on the audience and the objective. If I maybe unpack that a little bit, in some cases it's a hearts-based message. If I think about the Fixer campaign with Harvey Keitel, internal stakeholders, for the broad masses, it was a hearts job, a belief job. And so, I mean, we got the advertising agency, Saatchi's, back in to recreate their amazing best in my lifetime creative pitch. It was about belief. And so data wasn't so important. At a board level, the opposite. I mean, we didn't want them to engage in the creative. I mean, that would have been a disaster. So it was all about the numbers. And, we did, having made that instinctive decision around Harvey Keitel, we tested it very significantly and had the right tracking and metrics in place. So I think it depends on where on that hearts versus mind spectrum you are. Now, of course, the ideal is if you can do an and there. And I think this is one of the beauties of the Winston Wolf campaign, which was that it did an and. It was, from a heart's point of view, an engaging and perhaps surprising, but certainly rewarding form of communication. It was sort of not really like standard advertising. It was more dramatic and interesting and involving, even if you hadn't watched a Pulp Fiction film. So it was bold, it was daring, it was, it cut through, but at the same time, it was a very, very rational message. Under the hood, it was an extremely rational message. We will get your car back in 7 days. We will get you a new phone ordered within 8 hours. We will get you an emergency plumber within 2 hours. We will put you to emergency accommodation if needed overnight. And I remember describing at one point in time, in some levels, it was quite plonky advertising, because basically you just had a celebrity talking to a product feature. Now, of course, there was layers and layers and layers and layers on top of that, but it did, at its heart, successfully marry a message that connects sort of emotionally at a guttural, hearts-based way, but with a very clear reason to believe, which was the data and proof.
Very good, very good. As somebody who likes reading, writing about asking questions, and indeed asking questions, I've got to have a Columbo question. Is there any way that you have worked with data, that you currently work with data, that I haven't asked you about, that I should have asked you about?
Gosh, that's a question. What have we not talked about that's a thing? Well, let me just see if I can scratch around that little world brain of mine and think about something that might be useful. I think there's a little bit of me which says that there's a game to play here, which is that really being very, very tight and measuring what's measurable to death gives latitude and license to operate in that which isn't. So what do I mean by that? You could dismiss segmentation or customer insight or more qual-based data as puff. What one could. But if that is coming with the same veracity and intent from an individual or a leader or a team as the same leader or team that's extremely evidently very, very data-driven on these other things, then I think you get to a position of trust. And maybe that's the point, which is that being really tight on your data agenda, on those aspects that you can, build trust to to have the freedom. So I think the trust to pick Harvey Keitel came directly from evidently being very commercial and data driven. And so it's not a flight of fancy, it's not random. It's the same brains, literally the same brains who are making the decision. And so I think that's what builds trust. So it's maybe managing the optics, maybe managing the reputation. You could say, is that Machiavellian? And I would say, hell no. This is about getting, that using data to get a license to operate. When you can't prove things at the outset, where there is an element of judgment and skill and wisdom and experience. So maybe that's helpful.
Nice, really good. What's the worst example of a misuse of data that you've observed, either in the public domain or maybe in your own career? But what do you think is the worst example that you've seen in recent years?
Well, it does go back a little time, but it was a personal howler, which I'm now sort of at ease to talk about. I don't think there's sort of any reputational damage that can happen, but we'll see. Now, I went through the graduate scheme at Mars, had a fantastic time. I worked in sales and manufacturing, and then moved to Greece to work in confectionery advertising for a period of time. Then I came back to the UK and did pretty well. And I got to a place where I was, we were looking at the rollout of cat pouches, pouched food in the cat category. It was a runaway train. It was going brilliantly well in these little 100-gram sachets, which triggered all the right category benefits and proof points: cleanliness, freshness, variety, etc. And so we were thinking, how can we go even further and faster? And so I led a project which was looking at 200-gram pouches, and the data was so obvious. I mean, half of cats live in multi-cat households. And wouldn't it be so easy to just open one rather than two for your two cats? And so we did a massive simulated test market, where you build the shelves, and we did that in France, UK and Germany, and cost hundreds of thousands of pounds. This was going to be, from 5x or whatever it was, the whole thing. Absolute disaster. Absolute disaster. But why? So obvious. I mean, multi-cat households, 200-gram pouches, surely. But no, and the whole project was killed. I thought that I wanted the ground to swallow me up. I thought I was going to get fired. Actually, I had an amazing boss who said, well, that's brilliant. We learned. That's okay. But the thing we overlooked was that all those benefits in terms of ease and freshness and particularly variety was more powerful at a single cat level. So Tiddles likes beef and Toddles likes lamb. So when people came to the simulator, I can see your cat's tail.
Right on cue.
Right on cue. There
he
we
heard
go.
you talking about it.
Your cat's maybe salivating at Whisker's 100-gram pouches, but not 200-gram pouches.
Definitely not.
And so when people thought about this, they thought, well, no, I don't. I want to have the freedom and flexibility. It might be slightly cheaper, but I'm not that type of customer if I'm buying pouches. And so the one crucial data point, i.e. cats happen to cohabit more often than not, or at least 50% of the time, was a completely erroneous data point. And it, it did cost a lot of money and gave me, a bit of a headache. It was 6 months of my life that ended in nothing. But as my boss said, great learning. So no regrets, maybe.
Good learning. Any questions for me?
Any questions for you?
You don't have to have any questions for me, but, I've been asking questions. It seems unfair.
Of what I've said, what's most and least resonant? Put you on the spot.
I absolutely love the. I'm not the hair shirtiness, but the fact that you've managed to get through that, the 200-gram pouches, and using that absolutely as a means to move forward. I love the. I mean, what I really like is the rigor. You're talking about golden economics, talking about. Kind of how you not stumbled in. You were squeezed out by a corporate merger from your graduate job, and ended up in a role for which you were much better suited. But I mean, I think the fundamental thing for me is the degree of rigor and not taking action until and unless, we've done the test and we've demonstrated that the numbers show that we can go there. Candidly, I think, you will know this, you will know that not everybody in the world of marketing applies that degree of rigor and will be tested by the numbers. And of course, that there is always. I know you've used it. I used it on another podcast just the other day. The colouring in department phrase. Amazingly, one of my co-podcasters on this other podcast had never heard the phrase. I pointed him in many directions. But I think that willingness to be rigorous. And you talking about data giving you a license to experiment and to operate is kind of music to my ears, because it can seem to be a dry thing. What you've done to me is to bring it to life and to demonstrate exactly how powerful that can be, which is brilliant. Mark, tell us, where is the best place for our listeners to find out about you online, what you're up to, your podcast?
Well, thank you for that recap, Sam, and thanks for the opportunity just to say where people can find me. As we've mentioned, I co-host a podcast which you can find on Spotify, YouTube, Acast, etc., which is the Places Will Go Marketing Show, and we've 123 episodes and counting. Also, just get hold of me via LinkedIn. Perhaps the thing to say is I'm really enjoying becoming a coach. I've always coached, but sort of in a proper professional on the meter way. And so particularly if people want to kick the arse out of their first year as a senior marketer, then I'd love to have those conversations. There's a stat which says barely half of CMOs get to 2 years tenure. And obviously I had 10 or 11. And so I've actually been doing a bit of research, data-driven of course, around what are some of the top tips, some of the derailers, some of the archetypes of people in that first year particularly. I'd love to help CMOs to not just survive but thrive through that first year or so. So a little bit of an advert, but you can get me on LinkedIn, and happy to have any kind of conversation. But I'm really trying to build up a base of CMOs that I can help to accelerate and if not kick the arse out of their first year in the job.
Very good indeed. We'll include obviously links to your podcast and to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes. Mark, thank you so much for your time, for sharing your approach to using data smarter. I think it's fair to say if there were only more people with your pragmatic and data-driven, evidence-based approach, there would be rather less malarkey in the data world and rather more common sense. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Sam. You're very kind.
Thanks so much for listening to Data Malarkey, the podcast about using data smarter. To find out what kind of data storyteller you are, why not take our data storytelling scorecard? It takes just 2 minutes to complete and will give you a personalized report right away. Visit data-storytelling.scoreapp.com or follow the link in the show notes.